The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble courtyard of the royal palace as Lady Victoria Ashworth stepped out of her gilded carriage. Her emerald silk dress rustled with each calculated step, the sound echoing off the ancient stone walls. At 19, Victoria had already earned a reputation throughout the kingdom as someone who believed the world revolved around her perfectly manicured fingernails. The palace guards stood at attention, their polished armor gleaming in the early light. These men had dedicated their lives to protecting the royal family, undergoing years of rigorous training and proving their unwavering loyalty. Among them stood Captain Marcus Stone, a man whose presence commanded respect, without him having to say a single word. Victoria approached the palace entrance with her usual air of superiority, expecting everyone to step aside and bow as they typically did at her father's estate. Her father, Lord Ashworth, was one of the kingdom's wealthiest merchants, and Victoria had grown accustomed to using his influence to get whatever she wanted, whenever she wanted it. "Move aside," she commanded imperiously, waving her jeweled hand at the guards as if shooing away insects. "I have business with Her Majesty, and I won't be kept waiting by common soldiers." The guards exchanged glances but remained professional, maintaining their positions. Captain Stone stepped forward, his weathered face showing no emotion, as he looked down at the young woman before him. "Lady Ashworth," he said calmly, his deep voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned his position through merit rather than birthright. "Do you have an appointment with Her Majesty this morning?" Victoria's perfectly sculpted eyebrows shot up in indignation. How dare this common guard question her? She had never been denied access anywhere, and she certainly wasn't about to start accepting rejection from someone she considered beneath her social standing. "An appointment?" she scoffed, her voice rising to a pitch that made several nearby servants wince. "I am Lady Victoria Ashworth. I don't need appointments. The Queen will see me whenever I choose to visit. Now stand aside before I have you removed from your position." A small crowd had begun to gather in the courtyard. Palace staff, visiting nobles, and merchants conducting business with the royal household all stopped their activities to witness the unfolding drama. Many recognized Victoria from various social events and knew her reputation for causing scenes when she didn't get her way. Captain Stone remained unmoved by her threats. He had served the crown for 15 years, working his way up from a simple foot soldier to captain of the guard through dedication, courage, and an unwavering sense of duty. He had faced down assassins, thwarted kidnapping attempts, and protected the royal family through numerous crises. A spoiled aristocrat's tantrum was hardly going to rattle him. "Lady Ashworth," he repeated patiently, "Her Majesty sees visitors by appointment only. If you would like to request an audience, you may submit a formal petition through the proper channels. I'm sure the royal secretary would be happy to assist you." Victoria's face flushed crimson with rage. Never in her life had anyone spoken to her with such casual dismissal of her importance. At every ball, every gathering, every social event she attended, people fell over themselves to curry favor with her family. The very idea that this guard would treat her like any common petitioner was absolutely unthinkable. "Do you have any idea who you're speaking to?" she shrieked, her composure completely abandoned. "My father owns half the ships in the harbor. He provides grain to feed this entire city. When I tell him how I've been treated here today, he'll make sure you're thrown out onto the streets where you belong." The crowd that had gathered was now openly staring, some whispering among themselves about the spectacle. Several well-dressed nobles shook their heads in embarrassment, clearly uncomfortable with Victoria's public display. Even the palace servants, accustomed to dealing with difficult nobles, seemed taken aback by her level of entitlement. Captain Stone's expression never changed. He had dealt with entitled nobles before, though few were quite as brazen as Lady Ashworth. His calm demeanor only seemed to fuel Victoria's fury further. "My lady," he said evenly, "I understand you're disappointed. However, palace security protocols exist for everyone's protection, including yours. These rules apply to all visitors, regardless of their family's business dealings with the crown." "Rules?" Victoria practically spat the word. "Rules are for common people. I am nobility. I demand to see the Queen this instant, and if you don't step aside right now, I'll make sure you regret this moment for the rest of your miserable life." She stepped closer to Captain Stone, pointing her finger accusingly at his chest. Her voice had risen to such a volume that it could be heard throughout the courtyard, and more people were gathering to witness what was quickly becoming a legendary display of arrogance. "You're nothing but a dressed-up peasant playing soldier," she continued her tirade. "You should be grateful that someone of my standing even acknowledges your existence. How dare you presume to tell me what I can and cannot do?" Captain Stone listened to her rant without interrupting, his hands clasped behind his back in a relaxed military stance. When Victoria finally paused to catch her breath, he spoke in the same calm, measured tone he had maintained throughout the entire encounter. The crowd held its breath, waiting to see how the captain would respond to such an unprecedented display of disrespect. Some expected him to lose his temper. Others thought he might call for reinforcements to have Victoria escorted away. What happened next, however, would be talked about in the palace corridors for years to come. Victoria stood there, chest heaving with indignation, absolutely certain that her outburst would finally force this obstinate guard to bend to her will. After all, no one had ever stood up to her before when she unleashed the full force of her fury. She was completely unprepared for what Captain Stone was about to say. The morning air seemed to grow still as everyone in the courtyard waited for the captain's response. Even the birds in the palace gardens seemed to have fallen silent, as if nature itself was holding its breath for this moment of truth. Victoria's confidence was absolute. She had never met a problem that couldn't be solved by raising her voice and invoking her father's name. In her mind, this guard was already defeated. He just didn't know it yet. She smoothed her dress and prepared to accept his inevitable apology before sweeping past him into the palace. What she was about to learn, however, was that some people in this world possessed something far more powerful than wealth or noble birth. Captain Stone was about to demonstrate the quiet strength that comes from true character, and his words would not only humble Victoria but teach her a lesson she would never forget. Captain Marcus Stone looked directly into Victoria's eyes, his gaze steady and unwavering. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet authority that seemed to command the attention of everyone within hearing distance. "Lady Ashworth," he began, his tone respectful but firm, "I can see that you're accustomed to getting your way, and I understand that my refusal has frustrated you. But before you continue making threats about my position, perhaps you should know a bit more about who you're speaking to." Victoria's mouth fell open slightly. No one had ever dared to lecture her, especially not someone she considered a mere servant. She was about to interrupt him when something in his demeanor made her hesitate. "You see," Captain Stone continued, his voice carrying across the now silent courtyard, "I didn't inherit my position. I wasn't appointed because of my family's wealth or connections. 15 years ago, I was indeed just a common soldier, exactly as you said, the son of a blacksmith from a village so small it doesn't appear on most maps." The crowd leaned in closer, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Victoria found herself listening despite her anger, caught off guard by the captain's unexpected candor. "I earned my rank by doing something very simple," he said, pausing to let his words sink in. "I saved the Queen's life." A collective gasp rose from the assembled crowd. Victoria's eyes widened in shock. This information was not what she had expected to hear, and for the first time in the conversation, she found herself speechless. Captain Stone's expression softened slightly as he continued his story. "It was during the Harvest Festival 10 years ago. Her Majesty was visiting the market square, greeting her subjects as she always does. A group of assassins had infiltrated the crowd, disguised as merchants. When they struck, I was the only guard close enough to intercept them. The crowd was completely captivated now. Even Victoria, despite her wounded pride, found herself drawn into the tale. I took 3 poisoned arrows meant for the Queen," Stone continued, his hand unconsciously moving to his left shoulder where a faint scar was visible beneath his uniform. "I spent 6 months recovering, during which time Her Majesty visited me personally every week. Not because she had to, but because she genuinely cared about the man who had risked everything to protect her." Victoria's face had gone pale. The reality of who she had been insulting was beginning to dawn on her. But Captain Stone wasn't finished. "When I returned to duty, the Queen herself promoted me to captain of the Royal Guard. She said that true nobility isn't something you're born with, it's something you earn through your actions. She told me that a person's worth isn't measured by their family's gold, but by their willingness to put others before themselves." The captain's words hung in the air like a challenge. Victoria looked around the courtyard and noticed for the first time how the other nobles were looking at her. Instead of the usual deference and admiration she expected, she saw disappointment and embarrassment in their faces. "Now," Captain Stone said, his voice returning to its original calm professionalism, You mentioned that your father owns ships and provides grain to the city. That's admirable, and the kingdom benefits from his business. But what have you done to earn the respect you demand? What service have you provided to anyone other than yourself? Victoria opened her mouth to respond but found that no words came. For the first time in her life, she was being asked to justify her behavior based on her own actions, rather than her family status. I serve the crown, Stone continued, not because I have to, but because I choose to. Every man and woman in this guard has made the same choice. We've sworn to protect not just the royal family, but every citizen of this kingdom, including you. We do this not for gold or titles, but because we believe in something greater than ourselves. The captain gestured to the other guards standing nearby. These men and women come from all walks of life. Some were farmers' children, others the sons and daughters of merchants, blacksmiths, teachers, and yes, even nobility. But here, we're judged only by our dedication to duty and our willingness to sacrifice for others. Victoria looked at the guards with new eyes. She had dismissed them as common soldiers, but now she began to see them as individuals who had chosen a path of service. Their calm professionalism wasn't subservience. It was confidence born of purpose. You want to see the Queen, Stone said. May I ask why? What urgent matter brings you here without an appointment? What service do you wish to offer the crown? Victoria realized with growing horror that her reason for visiting was utterly trivial. She had come to complain about the seating arrangements at an upcoming royal banquet, feeling that her family deserved a more prominent position. Compared to the captain's story of sacrifice and service, her concerns seemed incredibly petty. She stammered, her usual confidence completely shattered. I wanted to discuss the arrangements for. She couldn't finish the sentence. The words seemed to stick in her throat as she realized how foolish she would sound explaining her trivial complaint to a man who had nearly died protecting the very person she wanted to bother with such nonsense. Captain Stone nodded knowingly, as if he had encountered similar situations before. Lady Ashworth, may I offer you some advice? True nobility isn't about demanding respect. It's about earning it. It's not about what others can do for you, but what you can do for others. The gathered crowd watched in fascination as the notorious Lady Victoria Ashworth stood speechless before a man who had just delivered what many would later call the most elegant put-down in palace history. The Queen, Stone continued gently, would be happy to meet with you any time you have something meaningful to discuss. Perhaps you might consider visiting the Royal Orphanage, or the Hospital for Wounded Soldiers, or any of the other institutions where your family's resources could make a real difference in people's lives. Victoria felt tears of shame welling up in her eyes. She had never been spoken to like this before, but she was beginning to realize that perhaps she should have been. The captain's words weren't cruel. They were honest in a way that no one in her privileged circle had ever dared to be. When you're ready to contribute rather than simply demand, Stone concluded, the palace doors will always be open to you. But until then, I suggest you take some time to think about what kind of legacy you want to leave behind. The courtyard remained silent as Victoria struggled to process what had just happened. Her entire worldview had been challenged in the span of a few minutes, and she found herself questioning everything she had believed about herself and her place in the world. Victoria stood frozen in the palace courtyard, her mind reeling from Captain Stone's words. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, with dozens of eyes watching her every reaction. For the first time in her privileged life, she found herself completely without words, her usual arsenal of threats and demands rendered utterly useless. Slowly, she looked around at the faces surrounding her. The other nobles weren't smirking with amusement at the guard's audacity as she had expected. Instead, they wore expressions of uncomfortable recognition, as if Stone's words had struck a chord with them as well. Some nodded slightly in agreement with what the captain had said, while others looked away in embarrassment for her. The palace servants, who had initially watched the confrontation with nervous anticipation, now regarded her with something approaching pity. These were people who worked tirelessly to maintain the palace, who took pride in their service, despite their humble positions. Victoria realized that she had never even acknowledged their existence, let alone thanked them for their efforts. Most surprising of all were the guards themselves. They hadn't joined in mocking her, or shown any sign of triumph over her humiliation. Instead, they maintained their professional composure, while radiating a quiet dignity that Victoria was only now beginning to understand. Captain Stone watched her internal struggle with patient eyes. He had delivered his message not out of cruelty, but in the hope that it might spark some genuine self-reflection. He had seen what unchecked arrogance could do to a person's soul, and despite her behavior, he genuinely hoped Victoria might choose a different path. Victoria began, her voice barely above a whisper. The words she had always used so easily seemed to have abandoned her completely. She looked down at her expensive dress, her jeweled accessories, all the material things that had once made her feel superior to everyone around her. Now they felt like a costume she had been wearing in a play she no longer wanted to perform in. Tears began to flow down her cheeks, smudging the carefully applied cosmetics that had taken her lady's maid an hour to perfect that morning. These weren't tears of anger or frustration, but of genuine shame and recognition of how badly she had behaved. Not just today, but for most of her life. "Captain Stone," she said finally, her voice trembling with emotion. "I owe you an apology. Not just for today, but for everything. You're right about me. You're right about all of it." The crowd stirred slightly at this unexpected turn. Lady Victoria Ashworth, known throughout the kingdom for never admitting fault, was actually apologizing to a palace guard in front of dozens of witnesses. "I've spent my entire life believing that my family's wealth made me better than other people," she continued, the words coming more easily now that she had started. "I've treated servants, guards, merchants, and anyone I considered beneath my station as if they were invisible. I've never earned anything through my own efforts, never helped anyone, never even tried to understand what real service means." Captain Stone nodded encouragingly, recognizing the courage it took for someone like Victoria to admit such truths publicly. "You asked what I've done to earn respect," Victoria said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "The honest answer is nothing. I've done absolutely nothing worthwhile with my life. I've been selfish, spoiled, and cruel, and I'm ashamed of the person I've become." The transformation was remarkable. The arrogant young woman who had arrived demanding special treatment was gone, replaced by someone who seemed years older and infinitely wiser than she had been just minutes before. "If you'll permit me," Victoria said, looking directly at Captain Stone, "I would like to take your advice. I want to learn about service, about real nobility. I want to do something meaningful with my life instead of just taking up space in it." A gentle smile crossed the captain's weathered face. This was the outcome he had hoped for but hadn't dared expect. "Lady Ashworth," he said warmly, "that's exactly the kind of attitude that would make you welcome at the palace any time. The Queen would be delighted to meet with someone who genuinely wants to make a difference." Victoria nodded gratefully, then turned to address the crowd that had witnessed her transformation. "I want to apologize to all of you as well," she said, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "Many of you have probably encountered me at social functions or around the city, and I'm sure I was rude or dismissive. That was wrong of me, and I'm sorry." The response from the crowd was immediate and surprising. Instead of mockery or rejection, there was a sense of admiration for her honesty and courage. Several people nodded in acknowledgement of her apology, while others actually smiled with approval. One of the palace servants, an elderly woman who had worked there for decades, stepped forward. "Lady Ashworth," she said kindly, "it takes real strength to admit when you're wrong. That's something to be proud of." Victoria felt a warmth in her chest that was entirely different from the hollow satisfaction she had previously gotten from intimidating others. This was genuine human connection, based on mutual respect rather than fear or obligation. Over the following weeks, Victoria's transformation became the talk of the kingdom. She began visiting the royal orphanage regularly, not for photo opportunities or social status, but to genuinely help. She funded a new wing for the children's hospital, and personally delivered food to families affected by the recent floods in the eastern provinces. More importantly, she started treating everyone she encountered with basic human dignity. Servants at her family's estate were amazed by the change, as were merchants in the marketplace and guards throughout the city. Word of her transformation spread quickly, and people who had once avoided her now sought her out. Captain Stone became an unlikely mentor to Victoria, teaching her about duty, sacrifice, and the true meaning of nobility. She learned that real power came not from demanding obedience, but from inspiring respect through one's actions. Months later, when Victoria finally did have her formal audience with the Queen, it was to present a comprehensive plan for improving conditions in the kingdom's poorest districts. Her Majesty was so impressed that she appointed Victoria to head a new royal commission on social welfare. The arrogant girl who had once demanded special treatment had become a woman dedicated to serving others, and it all started with a royal guard who had the courage to speak truth to power, showing that sometimes the most profound changes begin with someone brave enough to hold up a mirror to our worst qualities. Captain Stone continued his faithful service, proud to have played a role in Victoria's remarkable transformation. He often reflected on that morning in the courtyard, remembering that even the most unlikely people can change when confronted with truth delivered with both firmness and compassion. The story of Lady Victoria and Captain Stone became a legend whispered in palace halls and city streets alike, a reminder that true nobility is measured not by birth or wealth, but by how we choose to treat our fellow human beings. And sometimes, it takes someone of genuine character to show us who we really are, and more importantly, who we have the potential to become.